we need to call this to order and do public comment and all that good stuff? Okay.
Yeah.
Was Ann coming down?
No,
Okay.
if Doug came down, she was gonna stay in the office to get work done.
Okay, okay. Call the meeting rise to order for the pledge of right.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We'll open up with public comment. Is there any public comment? Seeing none, we will go to Bob Story, Montana Taxpayers Association. The floor is yours, Mr. Story.
Well, thanks for inviting me down to visit about a few things, and I had what I was gonna visit about, and then my computer shut off, so. Anyway, one of the questions was, what is the Montana Taxpayers Association, and what do we do? We're a organization that's been around. We're gonna have our 98th annual meeting first part of December, but we've been around for 100 years almost now. And we're just an organization mainly of businesses, large and small, that work on tax policy in this, primarily in the state of Montana. We don't get involved a lot in national tax issues, but we do work a lot in Helena with the legislature and the Department of Revenue on tax issues. My background is a farm and ranch at Park City down west of Billings. I served in the legislature for 16 years, starting in 1995 up through 2009. Worked a lot on tax and issues and school funding issues, which are strongly related to taxation also, especially property taxes. I took this job as the executive of the Taxpayers Association about 5 or 6 years ago, and have been working with in that role since then, as well as continuing to farm full-time. So like the commissioners, I have 2 full-time jobs, but like many of you, I assume also. But so what we've been working on lately, as you may or may not know, the last legislature put together 2 committees to study taxes in Montana and look at the tax system in whole. One of them that met yesterday is the Revenue Committee, and it's mainly looking at the tax systems, you know, the income tax system, the property taxes, some of the other tax systems, but in the end they're going to focus mainly on property tax and income tax, and then also the possibility of, if you want to fix either of those 2 systems, you're going to need another source of revenue, which the only source is a consumption tax of some sort. But I think they're going to spend most of their time just gathering information and looking at options. I'm not certain they'll ever come forward with a proposal for the next legislature. The second committee probably is of more interest to this group, and it's a finance committee, which is the budget, deals with the budget mainly of the state of Montana. But that committee is the last 7 or 8 years has had its hand in pretty much everything, because any bill that deals with taxes or spending that goes to the legislature ends up in the finance or appropriations committees anyway, and so they have their hand on pretty much every policy decision that's made in the legislature, if it has any money at all attached to it. But that committee right now, through their staff in the fiscal division, is doing a long-term look back and long-term look forward, and what are where's state money being spent and where's it going to need to be spent in the future. And so they're going to probably look at a 30-year window from 10 years ago to 20 years in the future the best they can. And they're also looking then, does the revenue stream look like it will support that needed spending? They're also the ones, which gets to another topic that Commissioner wanted to talk about, about the entitlement share is, you know, since that's a big chunk of, to them, a big chunk of state revenue, they're always looking at that as, you know, why is it there and what is going on with that. And so, about in January, I think, the second week of January, the legislature is all gonna be in town, or at least a great number of them. They're having a legislative week, some of the interim committees are meeting, and also the rest are invited in for some training and discussion, and I think that committee's gonna roll out some of the work that they're doing and talking about where they plan to go over the next year. By September next year, they have to be done with their work and preparing any legislation that they need. So that will be the committee. I think it's House Bill 715 study, what it's called. They'll be the one that everyone needs to really keep their eyes on, because they have, I mean, that's a pretty powerful group working on that, and they have some ideas about where they want to go. I think it's just they're not sharing them with a lot of people right now. So we'll be following that committee as well as I actually have a seat on the House Bill 35 committee, which is doing the tax study. That committee has 12 legislators on it and 6 citizens, and I'm one of the citizens that was appointed to that. So that's kind of what's going on in Helena right now, and that's what we're spending a great deal of our time on. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the entitlement share program, because it is important to counties and cities particularly. And I was in the legislature when that was created, and I was the chief sponsor of the bill that created it. So there aren't very many people around that were around in 2001 when that program was created. So there's not much understanding of it amongst legislators, amongst local government officials that have been working with it for 20 years, and the general public knows probably nothing about it. So it's but it's an important program, and I'll just take you briefly through the history of that and how it got started and why it's there, and what the challenges are with it right now. In 1999, the legislature went on a serious revision of the property tax system because of some things that were going on nationally: electrical deregulation, the deregulation of the telecommunication industry, and then the need to try to keep Montana competitive as a business location, especially with business equipment and things like that. So in 1999, the legislature cut the tax rates on a lot of property. They cut business equipment from 6% to 3%. They cut electrical generation tax rate from 12% to 6%. They cut telecommunications from 12% to 6%. They eliminated the tax on livestock, the ad valorem tax on livestock. It used to be taxed as property. And a few changed the oil and gas, and so we realized that would have big impacts on cities and counties and school districts' budgets when you narrow the tax base and reduce the taxable value in every jurisdiction in the state of Montana. And so when you do something like that, and it's easy to make policy in Helena when it doesn't affect the state budget, because the state budget doesn't run on property taxes. They collect property taxes, but it all just goes back into the school funding system. The 95 mills isn't used by the state to fund any operations. It's used to help pay the state share of the school funding. So it was easy for the legislature over a long period of time, not just in '99, to reduce taxes and go home and say, we've cut your taxes, and then your mill levies go up because the tax base shrunk in all the jurisdictions. And so in 1999, when all those tax reductions were done, there was a reimbursement method put together, and that was the genesis of the entitlement share. And it was a lot of money, you know, somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year between schools, cities, counties, miscellaneous districts. And so between 1999 and 2001, a committee was appointed that I chaired that basically had two functions. One, to deal with this entitlement or this reimbursement program. It wasn't called entitlement, it was just reimbursement for tax cuts. And the other one was to simplify the flow of revenue between local governments and the state government. And the problem at that point in time, and it had a lot to do with vehicle revenues, was that the county would collect a lot of this revenue. They would have to send some to Helena. The treasurer had to, as you know, had to distribute the rest of it to all the taxing entities. And some of that money would flow back and forth between the state and the county one or two times. And it was complex, it was hard to do, and it created some inefficiencies and inequities in the system. And so the other thing that we did at that time was we simplified this whole funding stream between state and local government. And it was a challenge and it was a risk for local government because the state basically then took all the vehicle money, they took the district court money, they took the they already were collecting the gaming money and the alcohol money. But we just took all that money and put it into the same pot with the reimbursement for property taxes, and that created the entitlement here. And we put growth factors on that related to where the money came from. The counties had a growth factor because their money was primarily vehicle money. The cities had a different one because they had a lot more. They had more gaming money, more alcohol money, and a smaller portion of vehicle money. And the schools pretty much only had vehicle money. So everybody had a different growth factor. But the whole point was that as the state's economy grew, so should this revenue stream, including the reimbursement for business for the tax cuts, should grow also, so that the local governments got a share of what was happening at the state level. So all these policy changes were made in the theory that, you know, if you lowered tax rates, you'd get more business and the economy would grow. But when the economy grows, what really grows is this income tax collections, which the state gets. And so the theory was we'd share some of that. Also at the same time, related to county operations, the state took over the welfare system, the district court system, later the public defender system, secondary roads, and so that the state took a lot of functions that the county used to do and moved the costs of those to the state. And when they did that, they backed that what was believed to be the cost of those programs at that time out of the county's reimbursement money. So that, in theory, the state, when they took those programs, took a share of the entitlement share money that the counties would have been spending on those programs anyway. So that kind of gets us to what happened in 2001 through, well, the public defenders were taken over Wayne Corey, 09, 07, yeah, somewhere around that neighborhood. But that kind of, from that point on, things were fairly stabilized in the relation between the cities and the county. So this entitlement program has been going on for 20 years, and it's been touched a couple times. When the state got in trouble in 11, they took the growth factor back for 2 years. Of late, they've got a whole lot of discussion about the public defender's office and how that program has run away once it's got under state control, and they want to keep coming back to local government and say, well, you should help us pay for that problem. We can't control it, but it's your problem to pay for it. And that's been some of the narrative, I guess, that's been coming out of the finance committee and their staff and that, you know, it's part of the exploding costs of the public defender has to do with local decisions. And the MACO's been fighting that, the League of Cities and Towns have been fighting that, we've been fighting that to some extent because our interest in the entitlement share program is we understand that if the state starts peeling that money back to fund state programs, they're not reducing local programs. That just means a tax increase for our members and your constituents. And so we try to convince legislators of that, you know, yeah, you can take that, you've got the power to take that money back if your goal is to keep funding state programs whole and don't worry about what happens to your local constituents and their tax bill and the services that are provided to them by local government. So we're fully engaged in protecting the entitlement program. We understand it, we understand why it was created, and we understand the ramifications if you start changing it a lot. So we try to stay involved in that discussion, but there's some hard positions been taken on that, I think, and it's always going to be a challenge, and that's why you need to work with Julie and whoever your next senator is to make it clear to them that, you know, this is an important issue to people in this county, that program isn't eroded because all it means is higher local taxes. And I think most people are sympathetic to the issue of what taxes are doing out there and the effect on that. So the entitlement share program is always somewhat at risk. There's a lot of discussion about the growth factor. The legislature keeps wanting to go back in and look at, well, what if? Who's the winners and losers on this? And when we set it up, we intended it never to be audited enough that you could tell who the winners and losers were. But people keep trying to do that. But, you know, once you quit counting cars and those kind of things, you don't. It's harder to go back and figure that out. But people are always working on that concept that maybe the state is paying out more money than they're taking in. Well, they were to begin with, and it has to do more with the reductions in tax rates than it does with anything to do with the transfer of money and the vehicles and alcohol and gaming and those kind of things. So it's, I think commissioners need to understand it, city councilmen need to understand it so that they can explain it to legislators and make the case that, you know, you guys got to go up there and help us protect this program. Don't worry about the state budget. It'll be fine in the end. But it's just a thought process that needs to be out there. Questions about entitlement share program? I guess I don't get spread too thin here on some stuff. It's an important program and needs to be understood and kept track of, I guess.
I have one, if I may, Bob.
Sure.
You said that the reduction in the entitlement share would mean an increase in local property taxes, and then you said again higher local taxes. Is there talk, I mean, as you know, we can't just raise taxes no matter what we need or what is cut at the state level. Is there talk of increasing the property tax rate, or what would be, where's the legislature coming from in the higher local taxes? Or
Well, first of all, as you're aware, and I think probably a lot of people in this room are aware, the limitation on local spending is in 1510-420. And that's a section of law that was created in 1999 and expanded with all the work that was done in 2001 to limit the growth in property tax spending, property tax collections by local government. And people say, why is the legislature involved in limiting what local governments can do? In 1998, back in the 80s, the voters passed an initiative that froze local government spending. It was I-105. And that went on in place for 15 years almost. And it was a pretty hard freeze, and that's why, especially cities and to some extent counties, went to fee-based systems. You know, garbage fees, water fees, sewer fees. Most of that was paid for with property taxes prior to 1985 and I-105. But as the property tax limits just limited what you could generate from property tax revenue, then you had to still provide the services, so you had to find other sources. So most local governments, they went to some kind of a fee structure on a lot of different things. In so people's taxes kept going up, and so again, a group of folks got together in 1998 and put another initiative on the ballot that said, you know, you can't raise property taxes without a vote, and you can't raise fees without a vote. And the voters passed that. That passed in the fall of 1998. And so when we went into session in 1999, we had to create a bill to implement that. And that bill was Senate Bill 184, and it was about that thick. Because you had to go into a whole lot, at that time, prior to 2001, the statute was full. It's basically for county governments. You can do 2 mills for this, you can do 3 mills for that, fairgrounds, weed control, whatever. Everything was laid out in statute about how many mills you could collect for any particular use. And so anyway, the voters said in 1998, by a fairly good margin, that we don't want any more increases in taxes or fees without a vote. And so the legislature set about to put that into statute, and we had that pretty well put together till about mid-February when the Supreme Court overturned that initiative because it was multi-subject. But the voters still wanted a freeze of some sort on property taxes, and so that's where 1510-420 came about. As you said, the voters say we want no increase in property taxes. Here's what it is. The statute says that. It has some, it's a fairly lengthy statute in what it says and how you know, what happens if A happens, what happens if B happens. And it was modified about 2001 to put half the rate of inflation in, because originally it didn't have any growth. And that's been a point of contention since 2001. Every session, a bill comes forward to raise the growth in what you're allowed without a vote to full inflation. And the legislature generally, well, has never passed that. But getting back to if the state reduces the entitlement share, there is a clause in 1510-420, I believe, that says if the entitlement share is reduced, you can automatically float those mills back. I mean, I think there's some disagreement about that, but that's my recollection, and I should get it up and familiar with it. When we created the entitlement share, that was the intention, that was a stopgap from the legislature of taking it back and then leaving you with nothing, is that any reduction in the entitlement share could be a local tax increase without a vote. Now, the growth factor was never that large of a factor that would generally trigger that, but if they all of a sudden said we're going to take 20% of it back or something like that, I think you could go in and, if you wanted to, and you know, being conservative as most of you are, you know, that's a hard decision to make, to raise taxes on people, but if you have to provide the services, you need to generate the money somewhere. So that's my understanding of how that would work right now.
Thank you.
But you had another part to your question. I rambled and I forgot what it was.
That was all. But I do wonder, for the folks that don't have maybe as much understanding of how local governments, cities and counties are funded, can you give kind of an overview of 101? You touched on income tax and how that funds the state. Can you talk about what the growth rate for that has been for the past so many years? And in contrast, you've touched on the 1510-420 and the 0.5% rate of inflation that we're allowed to grow. Can you kind of contrast the two so that people here have an understanding of where the differences are and perhaps where legislators don't necessarily understand that there is a big difference between the two?
In Montana, the property tax, when you spread it across everyone that collects property taxes, it's the largest tax in Montana. It's $1.7 billion a year is collected in property taxes in Montana. Of that, the state collects about $300 million in the 95 mills and another 20 million or so in the 6 mil that goes to the university system. And I said that 95 mils the state collects was all part of funding a school lawsuit about equalization of school funding back in the late 80s, that the state needed to make sure that you had rich districts and poor districts, and you didn't. The Constitution says the state will provide a quality basic education to every student in Montana. So that was the basis of a lawsuit in the 80s that said that the state funding system wasn't equal because you had rich districts that could provide a lot of things, and you had poor districts that couldn't hardly keep the doors open. And so the legislature spent a whole lot of time one summer coming up with a solution to that, and they created kind of what the current funding formula is now, and I'm not going to get into school funding any deeper than that, but what they did was they capped the rich districts. You could only spend so much, and they put more money into the state poor districts through subsidizing the mill levy. If you had a low value mill, you got guaranteed tax base, and so when you raised a mill, it had to bring in the average of the state. So locals might put in 60 cents and the state might put in 40 cents. Or the local might put in 10 cents and the state might put in 90 cents, just depends how rich or poor the district was. And so that was kind of how school funding worked. Cities and counties, up until cities started driving to the fee system, were funded a lot on property taxes. So about 55% of your property taxes go into the K-12 system. About 25% go into the city and 25% go to the counties, depending on how you're situated. But we had this discussion the other day, and Mr. Burton, who is the head of the League of Cities and Towns, pointed out the answer to your question that income tax, which is 50% of the revenue that the state treasury gets, is growing at about 9% a year. Property taxes at the state level are growing about 2.5% a year, except in reappraisal years, then they grow 6% a year. 1510-420 says the state is supposed to reduce the 95 mills when the taxable value goes up due to reappraisal, but they never have. I've argued with them that for years, and they won't. And until we sue them, they probably will never admit that they don't have to reduce the mills, because they have this theory that they have reserved mills that they've never used when they've been collecting the 95 the whole time. But anyway, that's the distribution of the property tax. About 55% to schools, 25% to cities, a little more to counties, and then if you include all the miscellaneous districts in the county share, you know, the conservation district and the weed control and stuff that are run on property taxes. So property taxes all end up in the local realm. The next big revenue stream is corporate income tax. That all goes to the state treasury. Vehicle taxes and fees, they go to the treasury now, but flow back through the entitlement share program. Oil and gas is kind of is one of the big revenue sources. Nothing is big. Income tax 1.5 billion. Property tax 1.7 billion. Corp tax, the next biggest tax collection, 150 million in a good year. Vehicles around 100 million. So that's kind of the breakdown. You have a bunch of miscellaneous taxes, but the property taxes is all what funds local governments. I think the charts that we were shown a couple weeks ago that the Infrastructure Coalition put together, probably a little over 50% of a county's budget on the average in the state of Montana is from property taxes. The rest comes from other sources. Probably less than 25% of a city's tax revenue comes from property taxes, because they have transferred so much stuff to fee-based, you know, street maintenance districts, water, sewer, garbage collection. none of those are based on the value of your property anymore, they're on a fee per use type of thing, so that's kind of the breakdown of where the money comes from.
Thank you. Can I ask another clarifying
You
question?
can ask them you guys can ask questions too,
And if anyone has a question, jump in.
Educate and medicate, or whatever they say.
To fill the silence, I understand too that property tax increase that Mr. Burton was talking about includes some pretty big mill levy votes that were successful in Gallatin County, Lewis and Clark County, and Missoula County. But the percentage is far less when you're talking about rural counties that have consistently voted down mill levies. Can you speak to that a little bit too?
Yes. I own a condo in Helen, and I pay as much taxes on my condo as I do on my ranch and my house in Park City. Their mill levy's pushing 900 mills up there now.
Wow.
Yeah, well, it gets back to providing services, and people have the opportunity to vote on raising their taxes to provide services, and lots of times they do. And then they get their tax bill and they come and say, and why'd my taxes go up? Well, they went up for two reasons. The value of your property went up, or the mill levies went up. And the mill levies go up for several reasons. Again, 55% of the mills go to schools. And school funding is based on number of kids they have, by and large. I mean, once you get by the base entitlement, every other factor, and there's about 6 factors in how much a school budget is, and it has to do with your base entitlement, the number of students you have, the number of teachers you have, how many at-risk kids you have, how many, some other things, but you build the budget up for a school. Well, they have to spend 80% of their maximum budget, and they can spend up to 100% once it's voted on, but they only have to vote those once. So once they get to 100%, they stay at 100% as long as they wish to. So school levies, just for operations, tend to go up some without a vote, but they also run levies to build, or levies for building reserves, or to do other things, and those tend to pass occasionally also. I mean, in Helena, they built 3 new school buildings in the last 2 years. Bozeman's building a new high school, renovating the old high school, so they bonded, I don't know, maybe $100 million. The city built a new jail down there, and so the county wants to build a new jail. They can't get their bond passed yet, but so I was down there doing a property tax discussion with the realtors there, and I'm talking about a lot of those things, but still, most of the major increases are voted. The one that affect individuals really is the reappraisal, and we've gone to this 2-year reappraisal cycle on residential and commercial and ag land, and previously we'd been on a 6-year reappraisal cycle. So you had 6 years of inflation every time you got your notice, and it was pretty huge, especially in the growing areas, 30, 40, 50, 60% increase in value. And so for like 3 cycles, 97, 2003, 90, 2009, the legislature went in and reduced the tax rates on residential property to offset the reappraisal. In 2015, they quit doing that. They went to the 2-year cycle and said, we're not going to, at least for the last 2 cycles, they haven't reduced the tax rate because of reappraisal, because of the value of that property goes up and up. In theory, the local levies drop to offset that. That only works if you're the guy right in the middle. That house went up, the average amount of it went up more than that, you still see an increase in taxes, and if it went up less than that, you should see a decrease. But for some reason, the 2-year cycles were almost seeing as much growth as we were in the 6-year cycles. Not quite as much, but it's still significant. The department just reported out yesterday on on at least their study of how accurate the reappraisal was, and it was just completed that you're now paying taxes on this month. And they're within 95% of the market value they feel on pretty much all their residential appraisals. I'm sure there's some that aren't, but they didn't talk about a whole lot about how many appeals to valuations they had and how they've settled most of those, but there aren't nearly as many now as there were when they were in a 6-year cycle. But be that as it may, the values of properties are going up, and since the state has never reduced its 95 mills, it takes it gets that extra money, and that amounts to. That's why if you look at the, I've got a chart somewhere in my briefcase because I put together about what the growth in county budgets or county mill levies have been over the last 15 years, what the growth in city mill levies have been over the last 15 years, and what the growth in state revenue at the constant 95 mills have been over the last 15 years. And all those numbers are roughly 50%. You know, the state revenue on the 95 mills has gone up about 50% over the last 15 years. My analysis of, we put out a book every year of the mill levies of every county and city in Montana. And we also have one that does it over a period of time. We have tax data going back to 1947. But county mill levies in the state have gone up about 50% over the last 15 years, and cities also, schools also. So the mill levies are going up, the values are going up because the state mill collections are proxy for what state taxable values do, because the mill levies don't change. So if revenue goes up, that means your taxable value is going up, and that's gone up about 50%. So revenue collected from the property tax, I said, is now $1.7 billion. I think when I started in the legislature, it was maybe $700 million in 1995, and the income tax was around $450 million, and now it's $1.3 billion. So all these revenue streams are growing.
All right, so I guess the question that I get asked a lot, and you've touched on it a little bit, is, you know, our residents see this growth that we're having here in our county, but they're not seeing it on the revenue side that we receive. So, for example, in looking at some of our reports, our market value has doubled since 2010 for Broadwater County. But you look at the taxable value, and it's considerably less. And I know that the state caps that, and you could explain how and why they do that.
Well, the first answer to that, and it gets back to this discussion about when the legislature was mitigating the reappraisal by reducing tax rates. And there's 4 classes of property that are valued on a cycle. Residential, well, there's 3 classes because residential and commercial are the same class. Residential property is valued on a cycle. Commercial is, ag land is, and forest land is. And in 97, 2003, and 2009, when those values came in, the legislature basically said on a statewide basis there will be no taxable increase in those classes of property. Well, commercial and residential are 60% of the value of the state, and then ag land is about 5%, and forest land is barely a blip. But if you say we're not going to increase the taxable value of 50% of the state, then that means you're holding most of the taxable values constant. Then all the other classes go up. They're done annually, and they tend to increase. But what happens then is in counties that don't have average growth, you take taxable value up. And counties that have above average growth still have a growth in taxable value, because you can't, all you can do is mitigate to the average on the state level. And within any taxing jurisdiction, you have houses that go up above and houses that don't go up as much, and when you hit the average, these guys are still above, still have an increase, and these guys have a decrease, but on the end, the averages should be the same. So the things that reduce your taxable value in a county like Broadwater are the depreciation of industrial properties, the sawmill, the grain elevators, whatever. Ag land has actually been going up in value just because its value is really driven by the price of wheat and hay, commodities. Pasture land by what rents are doing in pasture land. Forest land went down some in value just because timber's not worth as much as it was, but a lot of that, since they haven't mitigated anything lately, all those values should be increased in some. I didn't bring my big book along about what's going on over time in Broadwater County, but we just started printing a chart of what's going on with the mill levies, and generally a lot of counties are pretty constant mill levies, and cities are a little more growth, but some of them are up and down and up and down and up and down, and we don't have the resource to figure that out. But all we work off is what your folks report to the Department of Administration every year on what your mill levies are and your budgets are. But that's not a good answer to your question, I know, but the things that would decrease the taxable value of a county of late don't have anything to do with the state, at least don't have anything to do with the state Midland and the tax rates. They have more to do with what the assessed values are that are coming out of the Department of Revenue. Now, when 4 years ago, when they had the big revalued Northwest Energy, and then went back and revalued them again.
We know it
And then you
well.
sent out your tax bills, and then they revalued them again.
Mhm.
Those kind of things tend to happen, and they're, you know, the utilities are 22% of the tax base in Montana. Not because of anything great other than that they pay, their tax rate's 12% and homes is 1.35%. So if you have $100,000 worth of utility pipelines or electrical distribution, you pay 9 times the taxes per dollar of value that a homeowner does. It's just one of the inequities that got built into the system as we kept taking that homeowner rate down to deal with reappraisal. Someday that's gonna come back as I mean, I don't know if we can ever fix it. We're talking about it in these tax study committees about that inequity, but you can't fix it without outside money, without just shifting all that back on the homeowners, who are the voters who will have a rebellion if you do that. So, you know, if you're ever gonna reduce the taxes on industrial and commercial properties and pipelines and power lines and stuff like that to get them more in line with what the real tax base, the rest of the tax base is, you're gonna have to have other sources of revenue to do that, or you'll just create a revolt. I mean, I think one of the discussions you wanted to talk briefly about was what's going on in Colstrip. Nobody knows. I mean, some of my larger members are the West Coast utilities. They don't tell anybody what they're doing. Even their people that work for them in Montana really don't know what they're doing there. They just assume that something's going to happen one of these days, and won't find out about it then. But I think the writing's pretty much on the wall for the Washington and Oregon utilities that they're going to be out of coal. It's just how soon, you know. The 1 and 2 plants are supposed to shut down at the end of this year. They're going to move those out a month or two or not. The real question is what happens with the big plants, 3 and 4, that produce 2/3 of the power down there, and do they get mothballed? Do they get converted to merchant plants to try to find market somewhere? What happens to the transmission lines when that happens? They aren't really geared to deal with the intermittent loads of wind yet, but they could probably do that. understanding that those are the largest taxpayers in about 10 counties in Montana. When they start, you know, if they only need one of them, is the other one coming down? There'll probably be something there. I mean, it's pretty hard to give up the corridor because environmentally building another power line at the almost, even though the environmental folks want to push wind and solar, you still need transportation, and whether they would fight the construction of new transportation lines is always a question in that arena. But the problem when Colstrip goes down is the tax base, especially in Rosebud County, but somewhat it'll affect the state collections of property taxes. The big impact is on the coal severance tax and the coal taxes that are paid, and the stream of services that are dependent upon that. Half the coal tax revenue, severance tax, goes into the trust fund, and the other half just goes straight into the state general fund. And so that funds some services, you know, it's $30 million a year or something like that, but it you know, funds services that if they go away, then that legislature will be looking at some place to get that money from, and they don't want to raise taxes either. It's easier for them to steal your money and let you raise taxes.
Right, and I guess that was one of my concerns and where I was going with that, because there will be a revenue deficit at the state level, and how are they gonna balance that out? And it's usually seems like it's with the counties and cities.
You get back to your question, what's the growth in the state revenue stream? It's 6% a year. You know, you can't live on a 6% growth and off of a, you know, what is it, $2 billion a year revenue stream. You know, well, it's not quite that much, but because the income tax is most of it. But you know, it's a mindset. You know, I mean, do we got to keep growing state services? No, we don't. It's just easier to do that. We're having the budget director come and speak at our annual meeting next month, and hopefully I've tried to get him to talk about, you know, when he's sitting down putting together a state budget, just like you have two kinds of spending. You have mandatory spending, and you have some discretionary. And nobody's got any discretionary spending, hardly. You know, the state got to fund schools. We've got 2 court cases that says that, so that's half the budget, general fund budget right there. You gotta keep the university system going, or they'll raise tuition. So that's another chunk. Health and Human Services is a big part of the budget. You know, welfare, mental health, Medicaid, Medicare. You gotta fund those because they all have federal match. You give up $1 state revenue there, you give up 2 or 6 or Medicaid expansion, $9 of federal money. You know, but what decisions can you really make there? So your discretionary spending at the state level is, do you expand this program marginally? Most of the departments run on fees, AG and DEQ and DNRC, all other. Once you get by, you know, you're gonna turn prisoners loose? No, we'll leave them in the county jails, you know. It's stuff like that, that the decisions that they have to make, not very many. So it's just difficult to move that needle, but the growth in state spending has been constant. You know, I don't know what you do about that. You know, the legislature could do something about it if the legislature and the executive were both inclined to do that, but then it would, you know, you start about cutting state spending, especially in the social service area, then a lot of that falls back at the local doorstep. You know, you have more people on the street, more people. The sheriff department has a bigger load, the police department has a bigger load. You have to figure out what to do with those people that create those problems. So it's, I mean, the real problem in Montana is what? We're the 4th largest state in the nation, and we don't have enough people to make a decent sized town. You got 1 million people trying to keep all this infrastructure going. And we don't have a lot of it, can't export a lot of it. You know, 100 years ago, Anaconda Copper paid a lot of the bills. they're not here anymore. You know, for a while we export coal through electricity and that pays some bills. That's starting to come to an end. You know, our oil, we haven't been drilling oil wells hardly at all for 6 or 8 years. We're just not competitive in that arena just because of the better oil and closer to the refineries in Texas. Even the North Dakota oil's not as competitive as it used to be, just because they expanded the fracking technology into Texas, and some of those fields they found down there are just taking over the market. Just in a changing time, you know, that's why in the end what has to be looked at is the whole tax system, because as we become more and more a service-based, recreational-based economy, if that's really the future of Montana, you know, I mean, you look in this county or any county, you know, the recreation industry isn't a property-based industry. They don't have a lot of property to tax. They don't have a lot of year-round income to tax. So how does that economy contribute to your problem, you know? Is it a benefit or a detriment, dollar-wise? It gives people jobs, but that creates income tax money for Mont Helena. It impacts your roads, it impacts your services, but it doesn't, you know, not many people in that arena, I believe, have over $100,000 worth of business equipment, so they're not paying property tax on that. They might have a base, or probably a ranch that's expanded their operations into something like that to keep going. It's just kind of the changing economy, you know, the same with, you know, your retail. That's kind of where this 715 study about what's the sustainability of state programs came from is Representative Jones and his thinking about this a lot. And, you know, in rural Montana, where he's from and where we're from here, is what are your economic opportunities? You know, retail's going because people can buy on the internet. The roads are better, so you can travel. You know, you can run to Helena, you can run to Bozeman. The retail's consolidating in the large cities. So you're losing your downtown business district, which is property taxpayers. I truly believe that if an analysis was done that, you know, even though homeowners feel they pay a lot of taxes, they don't pay enough taxes to cover the services they use. I don't know that, but I just think that's kind of, I think every home, especially a city, gets, if it wasn't for the fees they lose money on in their budget on just providing services to. We're just in a changing economy, and our tax system is still built on the premise that people have a lot of value in property that you can tax to run it. And that's what local governments are stuck with. So your other question, what are the options out there for local government?
I got a question.
Yeah.
I mean, you've made some very valid points, and the fact is, you can buy everything you want online, so why have a box store? You know, Kmart's gone, you know, Walmarts have brought less items in. You're seeing those big stores just disappear because of the availability online. So why doesn't Montana take on the mindset of, we cannot sustain what we're doing what we have been doing, because our property values are going up, which makes no sense. I mean, in reality, you know, I remember last year, one of my friends in Helena was looking at trying to buy a home, and she was looking at 5 different homes, all built the same time frame. And those homes had taken $120,000 to $160,000 increase, which is just crazy, because you know, if you pay $250,000 to build your house, it really shouldn't go much more above $250,000. But why doesn't Montana go, you know what, why don't we do a sales tax like every other state in America? And then all that money from the 7 million people that come to Montana to recreate and go to our national parks, we actually get something out of that. Because there's nothing, they're coming here not paying anything, utilizing the roads, utilizing public safety services, whether it be fire, medical, ambulance, search and rescue. They're a burden, I mean, they're hard on our county roadways that the county's responsible to take care of. And it doesn't cost them a dime. So, you know, if you did a 5% sales tax, at least that 7 million people that come here and fill up their RVs and recreate and become a problem in our lives, at least they're paying something towards the problem.
And I don't disagree with the thing you've said, you know. As I said, I came to the legislature in 1975, and there used to be a sales tax bill or two show up every session. At that time, when they had a sales tax bill, you'd have to get the Supreme Court chamber to hold the hearing, and it'd take you half a day, and, you know, the bill would eventually die because of, you had institutional opposition from some of the Democratic legislators, especially from towns like Butte and Missoula and Great Falls, the stronger union towns were dead opposed to a sales tax. They wanted to keep riding the big businesses, you know, the anaconda companies. But by the time I got done in the legislature, which my last session was 2009, I don't even know if a sales tax bill came that year, but the last 2 or 3 sessions I served, when the sales tax bill would show up, you could hold it in the Senate Taxation Committee room, which is half the size of this room. And there'd be 2 proponents, which would be the Montana Chamber of Commerce and the Montana Taxpayers Association. And there'd be 2 opponents who were retired guys that had been just kind of lobbied on labor issues and stuff, and they'd show up and oppose it, and the bill would die. It just got to be the point that it really wasn't an issue. Some of you may be old enough to remember back in 1992 when Mark Roscoe and Dorothy Bradley ran for governor. Both of them ran on sales tax platforms. They ran on the platform that if I'm elected governor, I will promote a sales tax to try to break this property tax issue. And it was a close election, and Mark Roscoe won, and so they, through his efforts and the legislature's efforts, they put a sales tax on the ballot in the next election, and it was defeated 3-1. Now, it wasn't a particularly well-designed one, but it was defeated 3-1, and Mark Roscoe went on to be re-elected governor, and was one of the more popular governors that ever served. Fast forward to the last gubernatorial election, and what's the issue? The Republican candidate at some point in time supported a sales tax issue, and his voice is on the record of supporting a sales tax, and that's the major issue, one of the major issues in the gubernatorial campaign. And so he's running for governor this year, and his position is pretty much no way, no how on a sales tax. The Democrat candidates will not be running on a sales tax platform, and the other Republican candidates are either not saying what they're doing or trying to at least stay neutral and let's see what's going on with the studies and see what the numbers tell us, and you know, if people aren't satisfied with the current system, are they willing to look at a change? The local governments have come to the legislature every session I've been there and asked for the local option sales tax. It's never been given to them. It's never been close to being given to them, and it probably won't be for several reasons, and they are this. You still have institutional opposition to any kind of sales tax. So you have a certain group, a legislature who won't support that. You have groups like mine that say we're not in favor of a local option sales tax unless it's part of a statewide solution, statewide sales tax with a local option to it. You have people who say no new taxes, no way, no how. So pretty soon the numbers don't get to where you can get there. I think practically going with a local option sales tax without a statewide one is a mistake, in that most of Montana has no option to collect revenue on a local option sales tax, because you got no retail business to collect it. You're not going to have a sales